And good morning, everyone. Happy Tuesday morning to you, and welcome back to Morning Musings. My name is Don K. Preston. I'm the president of Preterist Research Institute of Ardmore, Oklahoma. Really appreciate you being with me. I forgot to tell you, mentioning over the weekend, had a fantastic weekend this last week. As you know, my hobby is cars, as you pardon me, as you can tell by some of my little models here, several of you, pardon me, several of you have commented about my cars, and I could only wish, you know, that I had uh, one of each of those that are represented. This little red fastback here is of a '68 Mustang 390 GT fastback. I do have one of those. This one over here yeah, this one here is actually a 70 model Boss 429. I do not have one of those. This one over here is a 65 Shelby GT350. I had one of those. Can't afford them anymore. And I've got some others, I've got a 67 GTO. I've got a Corvette. I've got a few like that. I've never been a huge collector of models. They're fun. I like to look at them and what have you. But some of the collector's items, the die-cast items, can get quite pricey. So I don't spend my money on those. Anyway, there you go. A little bit more about my hobby. And we are recapitulating our study, our lengthy study of the Olivet Discourse. We've been focused on Matthew chapter 24, the last three or four, or last couple of weeks, verses 32 and 33, where Jesus, after predicting his coming on the clouds of glory, or clouds with power and great glory, Jesus said, "Now learn a parable of the fig tree. When it put forth its leaves, you know that summer is nigh. Even so, when you see all of these things," what things? That's the signs that he had given in response to their questions. When you see all these things, then know that it what? The end of the age and the parousia, which is what they asked about. When you see the signs, you will know the end of the age and the parousia has drawn near. Now, this is a classic example of Jesus proving beyond a shadow of a doubt that time statements are objectively true. They want to know when his presence, the end of the age, is near. Now, is the end of the age always at hand? That would be one of the most ridiculous arguments that a person could ever make, especially after 2,000 years, for someone to say, well, the end of the age is always near. That's like saying a newborn infant is always ready to die. Now, can a newborn infant die? We know that. It's not the point, is it? And you know it's not the point. In 2,000 more years, will it be argued, oh, well, the end of the age has always been near. The end of the age has been near now for 4,000 years. Again, argumentum ad desperatum. It makes no sense whatsoever. Jesus is saying, here's some signs. Now watch. This gospel of the kingdom will be preached in all the world as a witness to the nations. Then comes the end. That means the end was not near, would not be near until the gospel had been preached in all the world. Gospel was preached in all the world in the first century, meaning the end of the age was going to be in the first century. Now, Jesus didn't say the gospel will occur immediately after the gospel has been preached in all the world, like some former preterists want to facetiously claim. That's just another argumentum ad desperatum. So the point being, Jesus said these things have to occur over a period of time. During that period of time, the kingdom is not drawn near. During that period of time, the kingdom is not near. But when these things occur, then the end will come. Fulfillment of signs, kingdom at hand, kingdom present or about to be present. And so Jesus' statement, when you see all these things begin to take place, then know that it, end of the age, parousia, is nigh. Well, it's really interesting, is it not, that in James chapter 5, James, living later in that very generation, and depending upon when you date James, you could say perhaps in the 60s, and in the 60s, Paul said the gospel had been preached into all the world. Colossians 1, 5-7, Colossians 1:23. So here's James, who knew the gospel had been preached in all the world, which was a sign of the coming of the end of the age, and said, now watch. Jesus said, when you see these things take place, know that it is nigh, even at the door. James chapter 5, verse 9. What did James say? The parousia has drawn near. It once was not near, but had drawn near when James wrote. Once again, the facetious argument of saying, well, the Lord is always here. Well, we understand the concept of the omniscience or omnipresence of God. That's not the issue of James's parenesis. But then he says, the judge is standing right at the door. Now remember, in James, he's talking to Christians who are being persecuted for their faith. Jesus said that the measure of sin of the Christians being persecuted for their faith, the measure of sin on the part of the Jews, the measure of suffering on the part of the Christians, that would be filled up in the first century generation. Not 2,000 years later, not 20,000 years later, not 40,000 years later, but in that first century generation. And Jesus said judgment would fall in that generation. Matthew 23, 36 and 37, it would come in the destruction of Jerusalem. Paul said Israel was filling up the measure of their sin in 50 and 51 AD, and judgment was just about to fall. John said in Revelation that Babylon, which is the city where the Lord was crucified, now held a golden cup full of the blood of the martyrs. The cup was full. And thus Jesus said, behold, I come quickly. My reward is with me to give to every man according to his works. Well, what is part of the reward? Oh, Babylon is fallen. Babylon is fallen. The hour of her judgment has come. Folks, how in the world did we ever come up with, it's a facetious question, it's a rhetorical question, but how did we ever come up with the idea that, the book of Revelation from first 3 verses all the way to maps, over and over and over and over, the Lord said, these things will shortly come to pass, these things will take place quickly and soon, and et cetera, et cetera. But of course, God didn't mean that. Because God doesn't see time like we do. And yet, guess what? People today, going back and reading that text which said these things will shortly come to pass, they tell us, you know what that means? It means it's about to take place now, 2,000 years later. So God didn't know what he was talking about, but people today do know what at hand means. They do know what quickly, shortly, and soon means. So when Jesus said in Matthew chapter 24, 32 and 33, here are the signs. When you see the signs, you will know that it is nigh, even at the door. And you have James during that very period of time that Jesus was talking about, the very period of time in which the gospel was preached in all the world, the very period of time in which Israel was filling up the measure of her sin. And James wrote, the judge is standing right at the door. Here's Jesus. When you see the signs, you'll know that it's nigh, even at the door. James, living later, seeing those very things take place, the judge is standing right at the door. But we're not supposed to pay any attention to that. It just means that Jesus is spatially near us. I asked one former preterist who has a tendency to make some of the most ridiculous statements that you'll ever read or hear in your life. I asked him, is there a single New Testament text, even one? Is there a single New Testament eschatological text, speaking of coming of the Lord, judgment, and resurrection, that can be taken to communicate the objective nearness of the coming of the Lord, judgment, and resurrection? And he said no. Now, how's that for having a presuppositional, presumptive, theological position that says, I'm not going to consider and I'm not going to allow any verse to convey genuine imminence? Now, this same guy, mind you, admits, says, teaches, when the New Testament writers, when Jesus himself said some events, non-eschatological events, mind you, non-prophetic events, mind you, but when he talked about events coming soon, well, yeah, it meant soon, quickly, shortly, in the objective meaning of imminence. So this former preterist has made up a hermeneutical rule, which you will not find in any work of hermeneutic that's ever been printed in the history of time. But he's the one that says we as preterists make up doctrines. So anyway, he's made up this rule that says in non-eschatological text, statements of imminence mean imminent. At hand truly means at hand. Temporally. Quickly, shortly, soon. All mean quickly, shortly, soon in a temporal sense. But in prophetic text, none of that applies. Argumentum ad desperatum. Folks, when we take Matthew 24, verse 32 and 33 seriously, and we let the Scripture interpret the Scripture, then all attempts to negate the biblical time statements disappear. They go up in smoke. They melt before us. Okay, tomorrow we'll conclude our discussion of the parable of the fig tree and verses 32 and 33 by examining, once again, a little more in detail, the dispensational argument that says, when you see the fig tree put forth its leaves, well, you see the fig tree is Israel. Isn't it amazing that dispensationalists like to talk about taking the Bible literally? So what do they do with Matthew 24, 32? Oh, it's not a literal fig tree, and it's not a literal illustration from the world of agronomy. No. It's a spiritual designation of Israel. What happened to literalism? Okay, I'll see you on the flip side.